it's one thing to start when you're 20 or 25, and have the value of compound interest over time and save that, $40 a month or whatever it was. But it's actually quite a different thing to start when you're 35 with student loans that need to be paid off and try to create a sizable chunk of wealth.
Welcome to the Personal Finance for PhDs podcast, a higher education in personal finance. I'm your host, Dr. Emily Roberts. This is Season 7, Episode 11, and today my guest is Dr. Chris Kornthwaite of Roostervane. Chris and I list the money mindsets that we have observed among PhDs and academics, including believing money and wealth to be evil, scarcity, relating time to income, and anchoring. We discuss how to identify and change your own money mindset. Chris shares how his money mindset has evolved from his youth idolizing poverty through his underpaid grad student years and now into his employment and entrepreneurial journey. As you'll hear during this episode, one of the best ways you can change your money mindset is by intentionally seeking out and learning from people who have the money mindset you want to move toward, whether that is through books, other media, or new acquaintances. If this episode convinces you that you should work on your own money mindset, I invite you to join the Personal Finance for PhDs community at pfforphds.community. Inside the community, you can communicate with me and other like-minded PhDs through our forum and monthly live calls. The community has a monthly book club and group financial challenges as well. In November 2020, we're reading Get Money by Kristen Wong, and in December, we'll read The Millionaire Next Door by Thomas Stanley and William Danko. Our challenges for November and December are to create a frugal stack and set up a system of targeted savings accounts. One of the ebooks included in the community, The Wealthy PhD, also has a chapter on what money mindset is, why it's important, and how to shift it. While I didn't understand it at the time, being part of the personal finance blogosphere while I was in grad school was absolutely vital to the level of financial success I had then and now, and was directly my inspiration for starting my business. With the Personal Finance for PhDs community, I've attempted to replicate many of the positive elements of that experience while making the whole process more time efficient and accessible for you. If you're interested in learning more about and joining the community, you can do so at pfforphds.community. Without further ado, here's my interview with Dr. Chris Kornthwaite from Roostervane. I'm so delighted to have joining me on the podcast today, Dr. Chris Kornthwaite of Roostervane. He writes a lot about PhDs and career transitions and career explorations over there, but he also has a lot of material about money, wealth, money mindset, and so forth. And that's why I invited him on the podcast today to tell us more about money mindset. So, Chris, will you please just introduce yourself a little bit further to the audience?
Yeah, for sure. So I have, in terms of my academic background, I have a PhD in religious studies from the University of Toronto. And after I finished my PhD, I was kind of lost and didn't know what to do for work. Kind of was the impetus for starting Roostervane eventually. But I went and I worked for a think tank. So I ran projects for a Canadian think tank. Kind of a lot of different projects, but some that kind of related to money that are still interesting to me is things like economic development and prosperity and things like that. And then I went and worked for the federal government for a little while, so the Canadian federal government. So I worked on a project that helps other countries launch refugee programs. So basically, it's a lot of like international diplomacy kind of stuff. And that was really neat. And I still do some consulting in that world, like in the kind of refugee program world. But I run Roostervane. So I started a blog, kind of chronicling. Initially, it was kind of chronicling my own journey out of academia, but it's just evolved to things that I like to write about. So it's become everything from a little bit on personal finance, as you say, to careers, LinkedIn, kind of ideas about like purpose, which has kind of really been an interesting question for me. So that's become about, like, I would say it's like maybe like 80% of the work I do. But it's not my full-time income yet. It's just, it's kind of growing, but it's, as you know, it takes time, right? So I'm working on that too. So that's me.
So interesting. Thank you so much. So money mindset is our topic for today. And I wanted to start off by asking you, what are the common money mindsets that you have observed in PhDs or academics?
This is such a fun conversation. I'm really glad to have it. I think the thing that I see a lot of, I mean, like we could talk about like scarcity mindset and that sort of thing, and that's certainly common. I think the thing that I deal with the most, especially as people are like leaving academia, and it's not just about money, but it's about like careers in general, but there's a lot of kind of constructs within academia, like ideological constructs that like money is bad, money is evil. It's like the pursuit of money is something that, especially for those pursuing life in academia, a lot of people kind of buy the idea that this is a noble cause and worth doing for nothing, basically. So I think that a lot of PhDs kind of have the idea that they shouldn't think about money, or that they're bad for thinking about it, or that they're not serious academics if they want to think about it. And the irony is that I remember having one exchange with a student in particular, and he was kind of saying some of this thing to me, and he was quoting his professor, and some of the things his professor had said about how this is not about money. And I said, well, is that your professor who makes $170,000 a year? So there's a huge discrepancy, I think, between the idealism of PhDs and the reality of both the academy and just kind of the quote unquote real world. And I think that's kind of the biggest holdup I see in terms of money mindset, is that people have this idea that poverty is noble, or that earning money is bad, investing is, capitalism's bad. So I think those become really big holdups, and I think can actually seriously hinder people from, first of all, making good decisions about their career, but also from actually acquiring wealth and kind of getting comfortable, even much less wealthy. Yeah.
So I think here your discipline might be showing, because
Oh yeah.
like in contrast, so I've heard the same things. But it was not until I started speaking with PhDs like more widely across a lot of disciplines that I encountered that mindset. Because for me, as an engineering PhD
Right.
and kind of in the STEM fields,
Yeah.
yes, scarcity mindset was there. Yes, undervaluing yourself was there, but not the money is evil like
Yeah.
aspect of things. Or like, because I think we were all expecting like, okay, yeah, this is a low income period of life, but this does not characterize my life overall. Like overall,
Yeah.
I'm going to be a highly employable, like decent to good, like earner as an
Yeah.
engineering PhD or STEM PhD.
Yeah.
And so, and honestly, like even in my, let's say path through academia in terms of like the professors that I interacted with, because I was in science fields and engineering fields, I didn't have any professors say to me like capitalism is evil or anything like that.
Yeah.
So it's not an idea
Yeah.
that I found until I started interacting with humanities PhDs
Yeah.
that I even
Yeah.
encountered that. And so I think this is really
That's a
kind of
fantastic
field
point.
dependent.
Yeah, no, 100%. I agree. And it's even like, it's interesting for careers too. Like I'm always kind of realizing where these field differences are. And it's hard because like I write for PhDs, like it's like one audience. And in some cases, I think there are a lot of things that are kind of universal, but you're 100% right. And I think a lot of the kind of ideologies around money that I was exposed to, and I mean, I still see them a lot, but you're right. Like they're definitely much more predominant in kind of humanities, social science fields for sure.
Yeah, but I'm so glad you brought that one up, because I think that one is maybe the most like insidious, like the hardest to
Yeah.
reverse,
Yeah.
which of course we'll get to in a moment. But that was a great like first observation to bring up. Do you have any other ones? Well, you mentioned scarcity mindset earlier, but didn't actually define it. Do you want to talk a little bit more about what scarcity mindset is?
Oh gosh, yeah. Well, I think like scarcity mindset for me, the way I understand it, is just the idea that like there's never enough money, and it's always I'm just going to be poor, and I'm always going to be poor, and the kind of, I mean, I don't know. We've never had the conversation about like the philosophies of money behind it, but a lot of the people that I read kind of see this as kind of manifesting into your life, that you kind of adopt this type of scarcity and it becomes true for you. Whether, I mean, there's a whole different conversation there we could have, but I think at least anecdotally that's been true in my life too. That when I kind of live this kind of scarcity, there's never enough money. I have to keep it all tight and pinch every penny and be really really controlling about my money. I think that's kind of what I see, and I saw a lot of that in academia. And I mean a lot of people are poor. I mean, a lot of people, I actually did all right because I won just kind of the right fellowships. I mean, it's just like luck of the draw, there's not really any reason why one PhD makes 15,000, another one makes 50,000. But all that to say that I saw a lot of that scarcity mindset. But the other thing that I think, one of the things that I really observed academia taught me was like this idea that I think the idea of like linking your time to money was really something that academia, like I didn't get paid by the hour other than when I did TA or RA work. So I think one of the really valuable lessons I learned in academia, and it's a mindset that academics have if you kind of dig for it, is this idea that you can actually, work on a grant application for, 5 or 6 hours and it might bring you $100,000. So I think there are also some positive money mindsets from academia too, if you want to dig for them, but it's just hard to get at them sometimes.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point to bring up. I actually wanted to go back to the scarcity mindset for a second,
Sure, yeah.
because there's actual scarcity in your life and there's the scarcity mindset. And those things can come together or they can be separate from each other. You can have one or the other, you can have both, you can have neither. There is actual scarcity, especially at the graduate student level in terms of how much money you're making. Now, does that apply to everybody? No, because of course there's fellowships you can win, you can have side hustles, but like there is scarcity in a sense. But whether it limits your mindset or not, it doesn't necessarily come along with that scarcity. And the other thing is the academic job market. Like there is a lot of scarcity in the academic job market. And I think that PhDs observing that market, even if they choose not to pursue it or don't end up in academia long term, they still take that observation with them onto their other like career paths and imagine the kind of scarcity in other places that they have rightly observed within academia.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think, I think one thing I'm thinking of as you say that is the kind of, a lot of some of my professor friends who sat on grant committees, especially for like university level scholarships, and realized how many scholarships actually didn't get any applications. So it also kind of does make me think that like there is of course like literal scarcity, but I think one of the ways, for example, that can play out is that instead of me saying as a student, like, how can I go make more money or how can I increase my income, and what scholarships can I apply for in this case, because they just didn't, like, there was a lot of years that they didn't give out a lot of the scholarships. It's easier just to say, well, I'm just poor and this is my lot in life and woe is me kind of thing. So I think I hear what you're saying. I totally agree with you. And I think there's a balance there for me between like the actual scarcity and the mindset that says like, how can I make the most of this? There's obviously there's going to be some kind of a limit, but how can I expand what I do have access to?
Yeah, exactly. I think it's really depressing for graduate students to think about their hourly wage because they imagine it's like, especially because they work so many hours, usually beyond 40, and yet they're only being paid ostensibly. You mentioned RERTO work earlier. That's typically limited to like 20 hours a week, at least in the US. They're calculating this off of like 40 plus hours per week when actually they're only being paid for 20, and technically they're doing their dissertation for free. And a lot of people don't like understand that. So it is depressing to calculate their hourly wage, but like you said, that's not actually literally what they're being paid for. And sometimes you can, as you said, win an award for just a handful of hours of extra work on top of the work that you are already doing. And so I do like the idea of like divorcing, the hourly wage thing. But yeah, it's really it's disheartening to think about in the first place.
I'm trying to look on the bright side. There's a lot to kind of be sad about the financial state of academia. So I'm not saying it's like great, but there are things that I've realized. I know we're going to talk about it later, but as I've moved into my life, there are things that academia trained me for that I'm actually like, oh, that's actually not a bad thing.
Yeah. So let's finish up talking about the mindsets that you see. Are there any other ones that you've observed, either positive or negative, helpful or unhelpful?
Let me think. Well, I guess so. I think the thing that initiated this conversation was you had mentioned a post that I wrote where I had kind of identified a lot of different things that I had learned. So I think I'm trying to think about how much they relate to mindset, but I think there are like principles, some of which do relate to mindset about money that students kind of carry forward. So we already talked about the hourly wage, but I was thinking about in terms of like scale, like when you think of like, I don't know, like a journal publication, like something, creating one thing that can influence multiple people. That's not so much a mindset though. I think the answer is no. I don't really have any other mindsets offhand that I'd talk about.
I think the only other one that I'll bring up is anchoring. So when you're in graduate school and you're making this tiny hourly wage, or maybe you think about your yearly salary also tiny, because you're anchored there, because that's like the first set, an early on salary that you've experienced in your life, you may not really understand your value in the marketplace once you go forward from that position, whether it's in academia or outside of academia. And so you're anchored to this, like, as you mentioned, 15 or 30 or whatever it is, $1,000 per year that you're making as a graduate student. And you think, oh, wow, could I make double that? And that's like amazing to you, instead of thinking I want to 3x, 4x, 5x, 10x, like, what I was making in graduate school or more. So yeah, I think that's another really insidious one is the ultimate
That's a really good point,
undervaluing that you do later on.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah.
So we talked about the money mindsets that are common among PhDs. These are not universal. So how does an individual determine what are the money mindsets that I currently have? And this is such a tough question because money mindsets are like, they're so closely held, you don't even recognize them as such, right? It's just how the world works according to you. So how do you identify your own money mindset?
I think the thing that helped me most was reading. I don't know when I read my first personal finance. I would say the first book I read on money was The Undercover Economist. And I read that, that must be 10 years ago now. I read it somewhere in my graduate journey, I think pretty early on. And it rocked my world. And I started reading every single personal finance or money book I could get my hands on after that. So I've read a lot of them. And I think a lot of what I saw through reading kind of reflected back to me in my own life. So for example, I started to I can't even pinpoint like where I got it from, but I started to see like things that I was raised with. So I was raised in quite a poor family. My dad worked kind of as a maintenance man in a hospital. My mom stayed home with 5 kids. And a lot of my money mindset came from there. There was never enough money. Money doesn't grow on trees. Money is for other people. And then we were also religious. So it was also like spiritualized. So it was like money. I don't know if we ever heard like money is evil, but I definitely heard that because like poverty was kind of noble, like poverty was like spiritual. So I think the more I started to read and just hear people name similar things to what I had felt and seeing other people who grew up in similar places, I started to unpack a lot of those. There was one podcast I really liked. It was called Profit Boss. She really did a fantastic job. Is it Hillary Hendershot? Do you know that one? I haven't listened to it in about 5 years, but she had done an episode on money mindset. And it was really good and really opened up to me a lot of my, kind of my own limitations. And that really helped a lot. So I think just hearing people name their money mindset and seeing it in myself.
So I totally agree with you that you have to start encountering like other minds to recognize your own like mindsets, and whether that's through reading as you were doing. I also early on in my like journey was reading the personal finance blogosphere like quite a lot. And so, hearing from other, personal stories of people who are talking explicitly about money. That's the thing, is you have to actually kind of get towards money or money related topics when you exchange with these other minds. So it's a little bit easier to do in an impersonal format, like reading or listening to podcasts or watching videos or whatever. But I'll add into that, talking with other graduate students, maybe like we mentioned earlier, outside your own discipline and outside your own like worldview, or not even other graduate students, but just like your peers, maybe peers who have real jobs, that can help you kind of open up. If you're actually, again, touching on these money or money related topics, can help you recognize what's a mindset in you and what's like actual like observable truth about the world versus just your perception of it. So encountering other people I think is crucial to identifying your own money mindset.
And I think there's an interesting, like the kind of thing that makes me think of is this idea of even talking about money. And I know like it's another thing a money mindset I had is like, we don't talk about money, right? Like we don't talk about it with anybody, with family, money, politics, and I guess religion are the 3 things you're not supposed to talk about, right? And that's definitely something that I've experienced. And I think it's true. It's funny, even with Roostervane. So for example, I wrote a post a while back and it was just for fun about like how PhDs can be worth $100K or something. And it was one of the most read posts that I've ever done, but it's actually one of the least shared. So that people were happy to kind of read about it, but like didn't really want to talk about it. So it's also like I think there's a lot of shame in talking about money and expressing an interest in money. And even an interest in having money or being kind of growing wealth. So it's that's another like mindset that had held me back in the past, and I think it's still pretty prevalent.
Emily here for a brief interlude. If you are a fan of this podcast, I invite you to check out the Personal Finance for PhDs community at pfforphds.community. The community is for PhDs and people pursuing PhDs who want to take charge of their personal finances by opening and funding an IRA, starting to budget, aggressively paying off debt, financially navigating a life or career transition, maximizing the income from a side hustle, preparing an accurate tax return, and much more. Inside the community, you'll have access to a library of financial education products which I add to every month. There is also a discussion forum, monthly live calls with me, a book club, and progress journaling for financial goals. Basically, the community exists to help you reach your financial goals, whatever they are. Go to pfforphds.community to find out more. I can't wait to help propel you to financial success. Now back to the interview. Okay, so an individual has started to identify their own money mindsets by listening to this podcast or reading your articles or reading other materials. How do you think they should actually go about changing a money mindset that they've identified as unhelpful that they have?
I've given a lot of thought to this. It's an interesting question, because I think, like, what I realize is it doesn't change overnight, and I will find myself even years later, like something I identified years ago, and all of a sudden I kind of will stop myself when I'm doing something and say like, oh, that's my like X mindset that is kind of played in, but it's kind of sneaking back in. So it's really, really hard to change the way that you are kind of hardwired to think about money. It takes a lot of time. I mean, I've done things like I do kind of journaling, and I will sort of journal about it. I just watch and read a lot of stuff. I think like really immersing yourself in things that kind of present a different view from what you're used to. So I think that kind of immersion has really helped me a lot. And I'm trying to think what else. Like those would be the two main ones. Just kind of exposing yourself to different ideas and kind of recognize that you're on a journey to change your money mindset. It will definitely take time. It's not going to happen overnight. And start taking kind of the little incremental steps to grow it. And I think also like education, I would say, is a big part of that. Like the more you learn about money, the more you learn about growing wealth, kind of the less scary it gets. It can get confusing because there's a lot of contradictory information, but it's at least less scary. So ideally, you're going to be a little more competent and therefore comfortable with actually thinking about and dealing with your money.
Yeah, I totally agree with you that like I think the first stop is sort of the extension of the identification. It's continuing to encounter other ideas about money. And maybe now you can kind of selectively go towards, okay, well, this is a money mindset that I would like to cultivate, or this is the money mindset I want to get away from. So I'm going to specifically listen to source X or source Y, which is going to help me move, again, slowly over time towards that more helpful money mindset. So yeah, I totally agree. Like, for instance, listen to this podcast. Maybe this is giving you a different, perspective on money than you had before, or like continue to read other sources. I know as I mentioned earlier, totally immersed myself in like the personal finance blogosphere. That was really helpful in changing some of my money mindsets, especially around like earning more, because definitely as a graduate student, I had those like limiting beliefs about like, I can't have a side hustle and like I can never increase my stipend, but that turned out to not be true after, working on it for years and years. I finally figured that out. So definitely getting around other people. I mean, I don't remember the exact like phrase, but there's that thing where like you're the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. And so with respect to your money mindset, if you've had, parent 1, parent 2, professor 1 in that circle, before, you can maybe at least with respect to this subject, edge those people out in favor of people who, have the mindset that you want to adopt.
Exactly. Yeah, I totally agree.
And I'll add in, you mentioned a little bit earlier, like abundance, like mindset and thinking and so forth. And I've also read a little bit about that in the entrepreneurial space. Like that's how I actually first sort of encountered the topic of mindset was through the entrepreneurial stuff. And so one of the things that is talked about a lot in that space, which I think might be helpful, is actually writing and saying affirmations. And you mentioned it's a little bit related to journaling. So basically what we're talking about is self-talk. Like you've been telling yourself, money is the root of all evil and capitalism needs to die and like I will never have money and all of those things. You've been telling yourself those things for years. And so now you need to start telling yourself other things. And so it might be, helpful to actually write down an affirmation, something that maybe intellectually to be true, but you don't really feel it. You haven't really internalized it yet. And start, reciting those to yourself, maybe it's once a day or a few times a day, to kind of get that self-talk like grooved in. And so eventually you'll go to it more naturally. This is something I recommend to people who I work with on money mindset. It's not something I practice all the time, but I do it from time to time when I feel like I need a little boost or like a refresher with my mindset. Have you ever done the affirmation thing?
Yeah, I do. Actually, I think I just wasn't clear in defining how I think of journaling, because I do journaling, but within my journaling, I do affirmations as well. So I have like every day. And there's one in particular, it's kind of like, there's one that I'll share just because it's been kind of a recent realization for me. Um, I'm not particularly religious anymore, but coming from this idea of my youth that like having money is evil somehow or whatever, right? I've really kind of been thinking through like trying to get myself to adopt the idea lately that money is almost like spiritual, that like having money and creating wealth, especially as an entrepreneur, is actually an indication of the value that I bring to somebody else's life, rather than that I'm, kind of our ideas about entrepreneurship growing up is like, well, business people, trick people into, into giving them money or whatever. And in fact, it's quite the opposite, that like my wealth, the amount that I get paid is reflective of the value that I bring to people's lives. And that's a really beautiful thing. So I think like that's one thing, just for example, that I've been kind of writing down variations of that for quite a long time now, trying to like really worm it into my head, because I really do believe it's true, actually.
Yeah, I'm working on a similar like kind of one for me in my business as well. Like, yeah, the amount of money you're bringing in reflects the value that you bring to the world. That's true if you have a job too, but
Yes,
it's like
yeah,
sort of
yeah.
brutally true when you're an entrepreneur.
Yeah.
Like you're real
Yeah.
close to, you're feeling that like all the time. There's
Oh,
no
yeah.
comfort of the salary.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked through what kind of mindsets you might have if you're in academia, how to identify them, how to change them or start to change them, because as you said, it's going to be a process. You've talked about your own personal story here and there throughout this. Is there anything that you want to add more so about your career or your financial journey, especially as it relates to your money mindset?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Like, I think I've had a constant evolution of my money mindset. And it started, I mean, back when I started reading personal finance books at the beginning, and each personal finance book was like a revelation, like the first one, like I remember reading a book called The Millionaire Teacher. I don't know if you know that one. And it was like, okay, it's like low cost index funds. That's how I'm going to build wealth. Low cost index funds, low MER, ETFs, like that's the answer. And then I read, the next one, and it was like, actually people with managed portfolios, do better over time. And like, okay, who do I believe? So I think one of the most interesting things about my money journey has been, first of all, just like digesting the huge amount of contradictory information out there. And there is a lot of it. And I know like, for example, I remember reading like Dave Ramsey and David Bach around the same time. And like Dave Ramsey's like, pay down debt, don't buy a house until you're out of debt. And David Bach's like, buy a house tomorrow, because nobody's going to let you leverage that amount of money anywhere else. So it's funny, like the kind of, I think like looking back now, I was forming a kind of, I was forming my own views around money, even though like there are little nuances in how they actually play out. But I remember reading one book in particular, and it was after I had read all these different people, and the book was, I'm almost ashamed to say it. There are like two money books I'm really ashamed to say that I like. I wonder if you could guess them. The first is Robert Kiyosaki, Rich Dad, Poor Dad.
Yeah, I was going to say Rich Dad, Poor Dad.
I'm so embarrassed to say that I like that one. First of all, because like if you Google Robert Kiyosaki, like, okay, as an individual, I'm not endorsing Robert Kiyosaki. He's had some interesting business practices and definitely has some interesting beliefs today. But the book was revolutionary for me. Like it really changed the way that I thought about business and wealth and just my own upbringing. The second one, this one, it's called The Millionaire Fastlane. It's by a guy named NJ DeMarco. And it's like, I would almost recommend it, but I'm hesitant because it's like a bro book, like he's just one of those, like he was an internet millionaire, and kind of, it's really like, especially when you read it, like even like there are just some things that like don't sit right. But the one thing that I will say that like hit me about that book is he said, actually when you look at like all these personal finance gurus, none of them got rich off of following their own advice. Like Dave Ramsey and Susie Orman, and like these people didn't get rich from, saving 15% of their paycheck. They got rich by creating something that had massive value, massive scale, and like creating huge personal brands and putting it out there in the world, right? And I think that was really what kind of like something clicked. And it was, I had been working for the government too, and kind of realizing that like, even though I was making quite good money compared to what I was making in my PhD, and like I was interviewing for jobs that would make even more, I was giving away a third of it in taxes. I was struggling, even like our family, like we thought, you're going to be wealthy now that we have a paycheck and I have a good job and I have a pension. And the opposite was true. Like trying to scrape together that, 15% to save every month or whatever it was going to be, it felt almost impossible, just because of the realities of our cost of living and raising kids and unexpected expenses. And I remember kind of thinking this through and saying like, okay, like it's one thing to start when you're 20 or 25, and have the value of compound interest over time and save that, $40 a month or whatever it was. But it's actually quite a different thing to start when you're 35 with student loans that need to be paid off and try to create a sizable chunk of wealth. It's possible. It's definitely possible. And especially at the time, I was the only one working. My spouse, Carolyn, was home with our kids, and she's a graphic designer, so she does some freelance work, but she wasn't making like a full-time income. So I think I just kind of came to the reality, and it was about the time I read this, that it kind of shook me. And I said, like, actually the way that I'm thinking about wealth is right for a lot of people, but it might not be right for me. And exactly, I mean, for your listeners, there's probably a variety of people. I mean, if you're a 2-income family earning $180,000 a year, it might be pretty easy to catch up, and kind of squirrel away 30% a month instead of 15% a month and catch up to where you would have been. But for my own reality, I fell in love with the idea of business and the idea that in my case, especially with an internet business, that I could start with almost like nothing. I could start with like $3 a month and create a business that's worth a lot of money. And like, I didn't know where else you could leverage that. Like you could have that kind of leverage or create that kind of scale from starting with like paying Bluehost $3 a month and putting my ideas online to creating something. And I don't know exactly, like I'm not great at evaluating blogs, but I think even today, Roostervane, from what I understand, would be worth like between $30,000 and $60,000, which is like, it's not a huge amount of money, but I started it last year, So like, it's thinking through, like, as a business person, it's just like thinking through business has changed everything about how I see money. And I'm no longer one of those people trying to squirrel away part of my paycheck or like, and those are totally fine. Like if that's the position somebody's in and that's kind of their money worldview, that's totally great. But for me personally, I just got a lot more interested in creating an asset, creating this asset that's called a business. And it changes everything. I mean, I don't really care how much I take out of the business. I don't care how much my paycheck is, because I actually love having money in the business to reinvest back into it, So it's just little things like that, but it radically reorients, like as an entrepreneur, it radically reorients your, I think your relationship to money, and it really changes the way you view everything. So it's been a long journey, and I think I've kind of talked for a lot about it, but it's, it's been really interesting, and it's still, I still have so much to learn, but it's just that constant kind of growth and realization, but kind of coming to the idea that there are some principles that I've come to believe about money, about things like scale and impacting people and creating value. And that's some of the things that I put on the blog, which is like, I haven't really blogged about like why you should invest in low cost index funds. I've just blogged about like, here are some of the kind of generic things that I believe about building wealth. So.
Yeah, I'm so glad to hear that narrative. And I see a lot of my own like story reflected in that as well. Of course, I've also come to entrepreneurship. So if people want to read more stuff from you, tell us where they can find you.
Yeah, well, roostervane.com. So Roostervane, V-A-N-E. It's kind of like a weather vane, but there's a rooster on top. So Roostervane. And that's where I blog about. My main thing is kind of careers with purpose. So it's just thinking through like how we actually get jobs and careers, but also like how we make meaning from them. That's the kind of humanities thing that I bring to it, is like how we think about meaning. So roostervane.com, you can find me on Twitter. CJ Cornthwaite is my handle. You can just search my name, Chris Kornthwaite. Twitter, LinkedIn, wherever. I'm always happy to chat. So
wonderful. And last question for the interview, Chris. What is your best financial advice for another early career PhD? And it could be related to something we've already discussed in this interview, or it could be something completely else.
Yeah, education, learn. It's amazing how many people can spend 5 or 10 years learning about the nuances of a field, but don't actually want to take any time to learn about the basics of personal finance. So I would say read as much as you can, listen to a podcast like this one, and just educate yourself, and you'll be empowered to actually create wealth and to get over some of those mindsets we've talked about. So,
well, wonderful advice. Thank you so much for joining me for this interview, Chris.
Thank you, Emily. My pleasure.
Listeners, thank you for joining me for this episode. pfforphds.com/podcast is the hub for the Personal Finance for PhDs podcast. There you can find links to all the episode show notes and a form to volunteer to be interviewed. I'd love for you to check it out and get more involved. If you've been enjoying the podcast, please consider joining my mailing list for my behind-the-scenes commentary about each episode. Register at pfforphds.com/subscribe. See you in the next episode, and remember, you don't have to have a PhD to succeed with personal finance, but it helps. The music is Stages of Awakening by Poddington Bear from the Free Music Archive and is shared under CC by NC. Podcast editing and show notes creation by Lourdes Bobbio.